Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to explore the strange and unusual world of medieval beauty standards. It's a world where the goal isn't to look healthy, but rather to look like someone who's just been out for a nice walk. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is where you are. It's always interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, turn off the bright lights and turn on a fan to make it feel like it's evening. Let's start our night together. In medieval times, looking pale was not a sign that you needed more sleep. It was a fashion statement, a way of showing off, and a quiet way of telling the world, I'm too rich to ever see the sun. Thank you very much. In the medieval era, a healthy glow was a sign of good health, not a result of going to the gym or eating smoothies. Tan skin meant you worked outside, which meant you were poor, which meant you did hard physical work. And in the 14th century, there was nothing more unattractive than knowing how to milk a cow. If you were pale, people thought you were important. When we say pale, we don't mean a soft, ivory glow. We're talking about porcelain that is see-through and has a pattern of veins. Your skin was so pale that it looked like you might have been startled by a ghost, or like you were a ghost. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate, especially if you were born with a working circulatory system. People helped it along. Sometimes, noble women and men would put white lead powder on their faces. It made you look dead sexy, but it was slowly poisoning you. But being beautiful has always come at a cost. Some people use cloths soaked in vinegar to make their skin look lighter. Others used a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites. This made the face lighter and sometimes made the cheeks feel like an omelet. They sometimes painted veins onto the arms and chest using blue pigment to make them look delicate. After all, nothing says noble like pretending your skin is about to split open. Literature also got involved. Romantic poems described women as very pale, white like snow, and sometimes as the moon in winter, which is a nice way of saying she looks like she might faint. I love it. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty. It was a way of showing that someone was upper class, pure, and not involved in farming. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning. In the Middle Ages, being beautiful often meant making a big commitment. When we say commitment, we mean a slow and decorative form of chemical warfare on yourself. If you want to have a really pale complexion, you need to do more than just rely on nature. They used makeup, especially white face powder that had lead in it. Yes, lead, as in the material we use to seal old buildings. But at the time, it was seen as really advanced. The result was a smooth, pale, non-glossy finish. This is like the medieval version of a Haida foundation. It made the skin look perfect, but after a while it didn't feel any better. White lead powder was made by combining vinegar and metal, then allowing it to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a fine powder. If you apply this every day, you will look like a bright, delicate aristocrat who has a secret wish to die. And if your skin starts to flake, blister, or fall off in small pieces, even better. This meant that the makeup was working. This was probably not a one-product routine either. Many people added mercury-based rouge, a type of pigment, for color, or chalk dust to make the paint last longer. Egg whites were brushed over the face to make it look smooth and glazed. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, someone had rubbed it on their face to look elegant. The problem with lead-based products is that, apart from the obvious issue of poisoning, they can cause a range of problems, from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to hair loss and even premature death. However, you won't find any of these warnings on most modern skincare labels. But the fashion continued because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, nobles often chose the scenic route to the grave. Men weren't always immune either. Some men in high positions also used powders and lotions, especially in the late medieval and early Renaissance courts. There, how important you were depended a lot on your appearance, or at least how good you smelled compared to your rivals. Of all the beauty trends in the Middle Ages, the obsession with high foreheads is perhaps the most surprising. This is because people were actually removing their eyebrows to achieve this look. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable. It was seen as elegant, intelligent, and divine. It was the amazing medieval building. The perfect forehead said, "I spend my days reading psalms and looking out of castle windows, not working in the garden." To achieve this sophisticated look, women went to great lengths, and some of them went a bit too far. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, and sometimes even scalp hair was removed inch by inch to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a trim. This was a big project to make the forehead bigger. In the Middle Ages, books on how to take care of your appearance told women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and creams made from things like cat poo, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches. All of this was done to make sure that their foreheads looked as clean and clear as a sundial. The results were very clear. Portraits from that time show women with calm expressions and very big foreheads. You could hold a joust, a type of medieval tournament, on their foreheads. This high dome aesthetic became a symbol of beauty. It was seen as the perfect look because of the combination of pale skin and soft facial features. It wasn't just about the face either. Fashion supported this look. Hoods, wimples, and hennons, the famous cone-shaped hats, all helped to make the hairline look higher, or at least hide the part where the eyebrows used to be. This wasn't just a one-off thing with castles. From England to France to Italy, noble women embraced the high forehead look, and artists and poets praised women with this hairstyle. But not everyone can afford the time or tools to make themselves perfect. So, in a clever medieval idea, some women pretended to have a new forehead by drawing it up a bit and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's right. In the Middle Ages, they had their own version of contouring. It just involved using a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, people didn't value eyebrows very much. They were actively getting rid of them. Today, people like bold brows and arches, and there are lots of tutorials on TikTok about how to do them. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, people thought eyebrows were just unnecessary face clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows so that they were almost invisible or removed them completely. Why? In the past, people thought that having no hair at all was a sign of being elegant and sophisticated. Eyebrows were seen as unruly weeds in the garden of the face. Some people even shaved the hair off their eyebrows, making sure that nothing would stop them from looking perfect. It's the sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influencers think carefully, mostly because there were no brow pencils to help them. In the Middle Ages, women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or even mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or arsenic to remove their eyebrows. Yes, arsenic, because there's no way to show that you care about your appearance without risking some facial damage. This was more than just a short-term fashion. Art from this time, including illuminated manuscripts, early Christian manuscripts written using gold and silver ink on vellum, and oil portraits, confirms the trend. Noble women are often shown with smooth foreheads and eyes that don't show any emotion. Their eyes are surrounded by nothing but skin. The result is either calm or slightly strange. It depends on the lighting. The no-brow trend wasn't the same for everyone, though. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows were still common, especially as styles from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire spread through trade and war. But the message was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to the court, sometimes trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a general style, though they rarely removed them completely. unless they had lost them in a heated religious debate. This means that in the Middle Ages, people thought that beauty was not about looking natural. They looked as if they had been carefully chosen, like they were showing off their good side. After all, angels rarely have brows in art. Was that just a coincidence? Maybe, but it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, it was considered attractive to have a little color in your cheeks. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of being sent to hell. The goal was to have a light pink color, like the shade you might get if you heard a slightly rude poem or went outside for a short time, but not long enough to get a tan. No way. A soft pink color on the cheeks suggests youth, fertility, and a long life. All things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could keep them up past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. It was seen as silly to apply rouge, and being vain was closely linked to sin. The church did not like women putting color on their faces, unless they were nobles or doing it in a humble way, which is a religious question that experts are still trying to define. But women still found ways to adapt. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even cochineal, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, there are bugs, because beauty has never been kind. Some rubbed their cheeks to make them look red, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment, dabbed carefully to avoid being spotted by both clergy and judgmental neighbors. For the rich, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were very poisonous. But the logic went something like, I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and respected by society. Rouge was usually put on with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool you could find that you hadn't just used to prepare a stew. You could only get to the mirror by going through a restricted area. So many women relied on their instincts, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. If your blush was too obvious, people might think you were trying to look like prostitutes or French courtiers. The horror. The goal was always just to make a little bit better, not to create a big statement. If someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny it and say it was just because of the wind. Even nuns sometimes wore a little bit of red, but only on special days. If you want to show that you serve the Lord, you could try putting a little beetroot behind the cloister. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look perfect, you were already starting from behind. In medieval times, it was especially popular for women to have blonde hair. It was linked to being young, beautiful, and good. The Virgin Mary was often painted as blonde, even though she was probably not. Realism was less important than light and color. If you were born with blonde hair, congratulations. You were thought to be lucky and probably got out of doing a few chores. But being naturally blonde didn't last, especially when you grew up. So, medieval women took matters into their own hands and sometimes used cauldrons. Some people used saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lime to make hair lightening mixtures. If you apply it liberally and then leave it to bake in the sun, a process called sunbasking, it will work. It worked best if you were very patient and tough. Some old recipes also included urine, which was thought to help make the color stronger. But whose urine? That part was less strictly controlled, but as long as it made your hair sparkle like diamonds, it was considered worth it. There's something a little bit gross about beauty, and it's always been like that. Hair texture was important too. Long, wavy hair was the ideal hairstyle, falling down the back of the neck like a divine curtain. But this was a luxury that only unmarried women could enjoy. Once married, women with long, golden hair were expected to cover it with veils, nets, and headscarves. As soon as you said, "I do," your hair became a problem for the country. Women of high status often wore their hair in special ways. It was often braided, twisted, or tucked into fancy styles. They did this when they went to court or church. People often wore ribbons, beads, or embroidery with these hairstyles so that other people would remember that they were not sheep farmers. Men weren't left out either. Men with thick golden locks were often shown as romantic figures in poetry and art, even though they were not as popular. In medieval times, knights with flowing hair charging in a battle were the medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was very important. It was seen as a form of money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless you were trying to get married. Then all of a sudden, it became really important. In the past, unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose. This was a way of showing that they were pure and innocent. But they weren't allowed to wear it too loose unless they wanted to look like an ethereal forest maiden. And this was only considered acceptable if you were a saint or a martyr. Otherwise, a gentle braid would be enough. But once you got married, your hair was immediately covered up. Congratulations. You now had a husband and an obligation to be even more careful with your money than a monastery is with its wine budget. Get to know the world of veils, wimples, nets, and kifs. A medieval wardrobe that made you look shy and covered up and could make even the most beautiful blonde girl disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical too. They kept hair safe from smoke, lice, and unwanted compliments from troubadours. The most dedicated women put on their coverings. A coif is a close-fitting cap that could be worn under a veil. The veil could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The result was that you looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, which was the goal. But fashion is rarely just about function. As time went on, people started wearing more and more elaborate hats. Nets were decorated with gold thread. Veils were made into starched shapes. Some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, decorated with jewels and tiny bells, because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. In many cultures, having hair that is not seen was thought to be a sign of being a good person. People thought that a covered head was modest and virtuous. But if a married woman has hair that isn't covered, people might think she's a prostitute or a French woman. Some women did not like this. They would let a little curl slip out or wear veils that were see-through, but still let the world admire their carefully dyed hair. Medieval loopholes were still being used. If there was one unwritten rule about medieval beauty, it was this: taller is better. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe started wearing clothes that made them look better. The hennin. You know the one. Those tall, cone-shaped hats looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples. The hennin was more than just a hat. It was a symbol of status. These hats could be as tall as 2 feet, sometimes even taller, especially among the French and Burgundian elites. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you'd knock into on your way to dinner. Hennins were often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade, and they had wire frames that made them look very aerodynamic. A sheer veil usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Now, getting your hair to fit under one of these things was really tricky. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. The space on the front of the helmet, again, helps the helmet fit properly. Comfort wasn't part of the design brief, but hennins weren't the only thing people were obsessed with. Some women wore heart-shaped hair decorations called escapons, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like wings. It's great for drama, but not so good for rain. Apart from the nobility, most women wore veils, linen caps, or circlets. It is simpler, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. People who work in the church and people who have traditional views were, as we would have expected, not very happy. They said that this kind of showy behavior could lead to pride, sin, and even neck pain. But hennins were still popular with the rich, just like most terrible but fashionable ideas in history. Men didn't wear towering cones, but they still made a statement with their style. Think feather hats, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that look like they could be used in fencing. In medieval times, women weren't expected to have athletic or toned bodies. No, the plan was to look delicate, shy, and maybe like she was recovering from a faint. The perfect body type was slim, soft, and a little bit ethereal, like someone who lived on honey water, beautiful poems, and maybe one figure that was a little weak. Women weren't advised to build strength or endurance in beauty manuals. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before quickly looking away and possibly swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was seen as a sign of nobility. This is because if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and less muscle tone. The focus was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a look of being very tired. Waistlines on dresses were often made tight, just below the bust. This was an early version of the empire waist. This made the torso look longer. It also made the wearer look taller and more fragile. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Corsets weren't available at that point, but tightly bound kirtless and sers worked just as well. But being too thin wasn't the goal either. In times of famine or plague, being very thin was a sign that a person was dying. A little roundness, especially in the face or hips, was seen as a sign of health and fertility. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic, you were in the best position. The advice about what to eat back then wasn't really balanced. People used to write books about beauty that suggested doing things like eating fennel to help with digestion, putting rose petals in your mouth to make your breath smell nice, and drinking wine to make your skin look better. Only eat protein if it still has a feather attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance. They were broad-shouldered, strong-legged, and able to carry a sword without toppling over. But even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with a refined posture, not brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power. It's like a medieval way of sending a flirty emoji, but with more spiritual meaning and less blinking. The best medieval eyes were big, bright, and deep, and looked like they were telling stories. I'm full of virtue and maybe just a little bit of sadness. Imagine eyes that looked like they had seen the fall of man and were still getting over it. Poets of the time really liked them. They described eyes as bright orbs, like dewdrops, or pools of pure devotion. They rarely said things like bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. In Northern Europe, light-colored eyes, blue or gray, were often seen as ideal. People thought of them as a sign of innocence and purity. They also thought that people with light eyes hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, people also liked dark eyes, especially if they came from a noble family and had a good dowry. It was hard to make the eyes look better. In the medieval times, people did not use eyeliner pens like we do today. Instead, they used charcoal soot and were always hopeful. Some women use a little black powder to make their eyes look bigger, but this can cause irritation, blurry vision, and sometimes even smoky eyes. But most women relied on nature and used special lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look down all the time, even if you trip over the cat. Interestingly, eyes that were slightly swollen were admired. It suggested that you were a sensitive person, religious, and perhaps that you just finished praying or reading something that made you feel good, like a long poem about being pure. There were no artificial tears, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. When it came to eye contact, it was a bit of a challenge. Some might see it as too bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. If you don't, you might seem dishonest or strange. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible but wasn't about to brag. Let's talk about something that is not often mentioned in medieval love poetry. Take a breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. While a knight might talk about his lady's red lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually didn't say what happened when those lips opened. This is because in the Middle Ages, people didn't have good dental hygiene and mini freshness wasn't a thing yet. Unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. But fresh breath was still seen as a good thing. The way it smelt in your mouth was soft and sweet, like a sign of being young and healthy. It made you think that you hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, even though the chances were that you probably had. Medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves and cinnamon sticks, and sometimes twigs too. It's not just about the taste, but also about keeping the mouth nice and comfortable. Imagine it's like the mint version of gum. It didn't make your teeth sparkle, but it did make you slightly more attractive, or at least less scary to talk to. People who could visit apothecaries could also buy herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were used carefully because they cost a lot of money and because it was thought that showing too much interest in something in public was wrong. We didn't know about toothbrushing. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. Tithing wasn't seen as romantic, but it wasn't seen as shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems like surviving winter or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noble women, the challenge was to avoid causing offense while still maintaining their dignity. People spoke to each other from a distance. People were not allowed to show any public affection. And when you're not sure what to do, just fan yourself and think about it. You'll get extra points if you carry a small pomander. A pomander is a small, scented ball filled with herbs that you can wave gently in your own direction when you need to. These days, a great smile can lead to a lot of dating apps. In the Middle Ages, smiling was risky. It was best used sparingly, like spices or when peasants revolted. Why? But in the Middle Ages, people didn't take much care of their teeth. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than for impressing people. Most people had teeth that were a bit strange or even really scary, especially by the time they were 30. So, the less people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely because they were careless. Tooth decay was common because people's diets were full of bread, porridge, and mead, and lacked things like toothbrushes, dental floss, or fluoride. Sugar wasn't commonly used in most of Europe, but even simple starches could cause tooth decay. Also, dental surgery in the past was basically like an exorcism with pliers. Even so, a healthy smile was quietly admired, but not loudly celebrated. White teeth were rare and seen as a sign of youth and good luck, and maybe even a miracle. But people weren't going around smiling big smiles like they do in those old toothpaste adverts. In fact, a quiet smile was much more fashionable. I think I might write a sonnet instead of saying how happy I am to be here. Some women even use powders made of sage, salt, or ground up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were only a little bit helpful and mostly rough. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, people were happy to have teeth rather than showing off. Medieval art, for example, almost never shows people smiling. Even saints and angels usually keep quiet, as if they know the risks of showing mercy. Men were not immune either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and strong jaw, but no ballad ever included the line, "His teeth shone like ivory." There's a reason why the song Troubadour mentions eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. When it came to how men should look in the Middle Ages, there were some strange rules about how they should look. You didn't need to be super fit, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The best point was somewhere between being ready to joust and being able to write a poem about jousting without actually doing it. The perfect man was tall, slim, and had broad shoulders. It was very important that he was self-assured and confident. It's not too muscular, which suggests it was a difficult birth, but it's not soft either. That suggested they were lazy or too self-centered. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if the squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Imagine a prince in a beautifully decorated old book, not a village leader. Depending on the place and time, it was okay to have a beard or a clean-shaven face. But either way, it needed to look like you had done it on purpose, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was usually cut short, especially for men of noble status. Curly hair was popular in many courts, especially if it was natural or looked like it was. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. Used small heated rods or herbal rinses to make the hair look and feel better. I'm not above doing a job that needs my hands, like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles my fringe. Clothes made men look better. Padded shoulders, tight waists, and fitted tunics help create the ideal body shape, with extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He moved easily, sometimes showing a hint of dislike. If a man was naturally muscular, that was okay, as long as he wasn't actually using those muscles to work. People thought it was okay to fight in wars. Hauling barrels was not. Most importantly, the look was easy to achieve. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were born a noble. You were appealing because of this. You were like a medieval version of a hot person, but without trying. Instead of going to the gym, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, managing scent became an art. It's not the glamorous kind of art that you might expect, like a walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5, but more like the kind of art that makes you feel afraid and confused. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we'd hope, especially depending on the century, location, and how often there was a plague. To avoid offending anyone's smell, medieval people used herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's start with the commander. It is a small, hollow metal ball that is worn on a chain or pinned to clothing. It is filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance. They were portable smell shields. Imagine they're like medieval walking balms. The nobility also liked perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything could be used to make the smell better, including hair, which was sometimes made to smell better with flower water or vinegar. This smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval clothes were heavy. Summers were hot, and people still didn't have deodorant. The answer was layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more often than wool or silk. They added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat bad smells. Baths were popular, especially in the early and late medieval periods, but they were not always easy to get to. The church did not approve of people being naked together, which made people less interested in keeping clean. Many people tried dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. If you wipe yourself with a cloth and then spray on some perfume, that counts as washing your hands. And then there were the people who did more than was expected of them. Some people kept flower petals in their shoes or stuffed herbs in their bed sheets so that their rooms would smell a bit like a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just about how someone looked on the outside. It was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a blessing from God, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself. Sometimes I eat all three before breakfast. To be beautiful was to have a very difficult time. In the past, people thought that physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, and a pale complexion were signs of virtue. If you were nice, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least unlikely to steal sheep. People like poets, preachers, and painters all said that beauty was a sign of a good soul. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or even used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Don't forget, vanity was a sin. If someone was too interested in their appearance, it meant they were proud, trying to seduce others, or even worse, showing a tendency towards French behavior. In the Middle Ages, sermons told women that men would be tempted to commit sin because of their beauty, and the woman would be to blame for this. Eve set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. If a woman wore makeup, showed a little hair, or fluttered her eyelashes at the wrong time, people might say she was bad or even evil. Some even thought that beauty could be a trick, like a sorceress's disguise, or a magic trick made by witches to trick good men. This might sound a bit extreme, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you killed. On the other hand, people who were plain or had problems with their looks were sometimes thought to be bad or just unlucky. People liked the idea that how a character looked was important for who they were. Some people believed it. To be beautiful meant to be graceful. If someone was ugly, they might be punished, get sick, or be disappointed by a higher power. Things were very confusing, of course. You can be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Be kind, but not so much that it looks like pride, and above all, never try to look more attractive than the wife of the local lord. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So, in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about how things looked. They were very strict about morality, balancing vanity, being vain, and virtue, being good. They also had a lot of powdered lead, a type of white makeup, in their makeup kit. The Persian immortals were more than just elite troops. They were a statement, a living symbol of imperial strength, precision, and unyielding continuity. They first appeared at the time of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. At a time when Persia was quickly becoming a powerful empire, Cyrus understood something very important. An empire needs a strong leadership. It needs more than just administrators and governors. It needs a special group of people who can make others follow orders, make people loyal to the empire, and stop rebellions. And so the Immortals came into being. The name Immortals wasn't just a fancy title. It was very well thought out, and it made the players feel good. Herodotus said that they always kept their strength exactly at 10,000 men. If one man died, fell ill, or was wounded, he was instantly replaced. The numbers never changed. It looked like they couldn't be beaten, couldn't be made weaker, and most importantly, couldn't be killed. Whether it's a myth or just clever bookkeeping, the image stuck and the name survived. In this case, being immortal wasn't about just surviving. It was about the everlasting power of the Persian Empire. These men weren't just random conscripts. To become an immortal, you had to be chosen from among the Persian nobility, or at least from families of high status and proven loyalty. Training began when he was young. Discipline was very strict. They were completely loyal to the king. They were expected to be not just warriors, but also to set an example of the values of aid, order, obedience, and composure under pressure. They wore fancy clothes made of nice materials, and they had scale armor under their clothes. They often had a spear, a bow, a short sword, and a wicker shield. They appeared as they did because they had planned it, and they had also planned their tactics. The Persian kings weren't just sending warriors into battle. They were sending a political message wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire expanded, the immortals followed. They stood behind kings, beside thrones, and at the front of the battlefield. If you saw them coming, you didn't just see soldiers. You saw how strong the empire was. The gods did not flinch. The gods of the dead did not run away. Immortals continued to exist. That's exactly what made them scary. The Persian immortals didn't just appear by chance. It was a form of psychological warfare. These men weren't covered head to toe in shiny bronze like the hoplites of Greece. No, the immortals looked otherworldly, like a wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping across the land. Their uniforms blended a regal style with practical military functionality. They wore fancy tunics and trousers, often dyed in bright reds and purples, colors that showed they were important. Under these was a layer of scale armor made of bronze or iron. This armor was flexible enough to allow movement, but deadly in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, which was deceptively light, yet could still stop arrows and take hits. The thing that made them stand out most was their hat. This was a soft felt hat called a tiara, which they sometimes pulled over their face to hide who they were. The Greeks were all about glory and bravery, but the immortals were better in their uniforms. 10,000 men moved in near silence, all looking the same and wearing the same armor, which was very impressive to see. It was like watching a curtain of death descend on the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a bow with arrows, and a short sword or a belt. But perhaps most impressive was their ability to move quickly and remain deadly in almost any type of terrain. Their training focused more on being quick and fit than on being strong. They could march across whole provinces without getting out of order. And unlike many ancient forces, the immortals were equally comfortable fighting in open battle or serving as imperial guards in royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to be easily set up, but strong enough to be scary and destroy things. It wasn't about using brute force. It was about consistency, about never failing, never stumbling, and never looking weak. The fact that they always looked the same and nobody ever knew where they came from made them famous. When they marched into battle, drums would pound and dust would rise behind them, but they didn't look scared. There is no roaring or boasting, just eerie, precise synchronization. They looked like machines, not people, made not of flesh but of discipline, ritual, and fear. Facing the immortals wasn't just about facing death. It was to face a concept that some armies didn't just fight. They carried on without stopping or feeling sorry for themselves. Becoming an immortal was not just a job. It was a way of showing who they were and how important they were. They were respected and well paid, but there was a lot of pressure on them. These men were always being watched. The state provided them with food, clothing, and housing, but not out of kindness. It was to make sure he had total control. As soon as they joined the army, they belonged to the empire, not their families. Most immortals were from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but lower-ranking sons of loyal families could rise into the ranks if they showed exceptional discipline. People started training when they were children, often in the military attached to the royal court. Boys learned archery on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in step, and most importantly, how to obey without hesitation. There was no room for seeking glory or personal ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was corrected. The formation was very important. What was most important to me was unity. Discipline was important to them. They had to follow a strict daily routine. Wake up before sunrise, practice your shooting skills quietly, and take care of your weapons and armor. Food was eaten together and was always simple and planned to provide the energy needed for work. The people ate meat, flatbread, dates, and wine a lot. But people were told not to waste money on luxuries. The empire needed warriors, not rich, well-bred, well-educated people. When they weren't campaigning, the immortals protected the king and his court. But even then, their duties were more than just for show. They stood watch for assassination attempts, monitored nobles for disloyalty, and maintained order in the most volatile places of the empire. Their presence was so powerful that even in a royal hall, they could stop anyone from speaking out. They were the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. They did still have contact with their family. Immortals were allowed to marry and have families, but they could be called at any time. When their duty called, they left everything behind, no questions asked. If a man hesitated even once, he could be replaced without anyone noticing. The number had to stay at 10,000. There are no gaps or delays. It was this clever system that made their stories come true. They didn't just fight with discipline. They lived in a disciplined way. They were tools of empire, made better and better, until all that was left was duty. If Cyrus the Great created the immortals, it was Darius the Great who made them perfect. Darius came to power in 522 BCE after a lot of conspiracy in the palace and a murder. The immortals were the tool he used to make his reign legitimate and stable. They were no longer just a personal guard. They were part of the royal authority and were part of the growing system of government. Darius understood that power didn't only come from military strength, but from the idea of order and inevitability. And nothing made that image more obvious than the immortals. He showed them off at festivals, had them standing out in a prominent position around his new capital of Peles, and sent them on well-known missions. They were always in the same place, always calm, and always the same. 10,000 faces of Persian dominance that will never fade. But Darius also changed how they played. Under his leadership, the immortals became a key part of Persian combined arms warfare. They were used in attacks together with archers, cavalry, and chariots. Darius thought it was very important to be able to change plans, and the immortals had to be able to do the same. They practiced fighting in different ways, like combat with long weapons, attacking a city, and working together on a battlefield. Later Greek observers reported that they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing arrows and volleys while slowly advancing behind their wicker shields, always staying in formation. They also became heavily involved in stopping rebellions. Darius's empire was huge. It stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and there were lots of revolts. The immortals were often the first to fight back in Elilam, Babylon, and Saya. They were both a punishment and a message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is endless. They became more well known for their bad behavior during the rule of Darius. They're not just elite warriors, but instruments of fear and retribution. Even their symbols and images were made to look better. Carvings at Pepololis show them in perfect lines with a simple, stylized look and the same shape, as if they were facing eternity in stone. These weren't just ordinary portraits. They were propaganda. Darius wanted everyone to know. These men are always here, always armed, and they never die. If you step out of line, you'll meet 1 or 10,000. Darius made the immortals more than just a military unit. They were a kind of fear that was part of the royal image, used very carefully and spoken about in a quiet way. The Persian kings were the most famous during the reign of Xerxes the Great. Their reputation was tested more than anywhere else at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BC. This battle, which has been made into art and films for centuries, wasn't just a fight between armies. It was a symbolic clash between two very different ways of thinking: the Persian Empire versus the rebellious Greek city-states. And at the center of the storm stood the Immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the Immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just protect him. They were very important in the middle of all the chaos. People already knew about them. The Greeks had heard of the 10,000 who never died. These were the elite troops who served kings like gods and fought with perfect precision. At Thermopylae, they met people who did not believe in their story. King Leonidas and his small Greek army, including 300 Spartans, held the narrow pass against many attacks from the Persians. On the second day of the battle, Xerxes ordered the Immortals to break through the Greek line. It was meant to be a big defeat. After all, these were the best of the best. But what happened next was not what Xerxes had expected. The Immortal warriors were skilled, but the narrow pass was too small for them to move around in. Their long branches were almost useless in such a small space, and their short spears couldn't reach past the long handles of the Greek torches. For hours, they fought Spartans who were well-trained and fought closely together, like they had practiced. The Immortals suffered heavy losses. Herodotus noted that they were no more successful than the ordinary troops, perhaps with some glee. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a big change for their image. The Immortals had always seemed invincible, like gods of war wearing silk and scales. But at Thermopylae they bled. They died. For the first time, the idea that they would live forever was broken by the power of the Spartans and the courage of the Greeks. But even when they lost, they were still scary. They got used to it. They regrouped, and they marched again. After all, being immortal didn't mean being invincible. It was about staying strong. The most interesting thing about the Persian Immortals wasn't just how they trained or the tactics they used in battle. It was their system. What made them immortal was not magic or divine intervention. It was the administration. A cold, efficient, and relentless system of bureaucracy. When one immortal died, whether in battle, from illness, or by retirement, another took his place right away. There is no ceremony, just a smooth change. The total number never changed, always being 10,000. This wasn't an exaggeration. It was deliberate. The Achaemenid Empire was run on logistics, and the Immortals were the best example of this. They always had a group of trainees and apprentices, young men who were being prepared to fill any gaps in the team as soon as they happened. These replacements were kept in the capital city, supervised, trained, and given easier tasks until they were needed. This meant that the Immortals were much more than just a special group of fighters. They were a living system of excellence, always changing and growing. To make this happen, records were kept very carefully. The officers were called Hazarapatis, which literally means commander of 1,000. They were in charge of recruitment, discipline, and supplies. There were 10 such commanders working under the leader of the Immortals. Below them, a group of subcommanders, scribes, and quartermasters made sure that each soldier had the right weapons, food, a place to sleep, and medical care. Did you lose a man in Egypt? A replacement is sent from Susa. A soldier breaks a leg during a patrol in Media. His successor is already packing his stuff. This machinery was used for more than just military readiness. It was all in the mind. The idea that there were 10,000 warriors who never changed was a way of spreading fear and terror among the people. If one was killed, another would immediately take its place. It didn't matter who they were. Who they were wasn't important. The presence was always there. The Immortals created an illusion of unstoppable force because the machine never stopped. Even when they weren't fighting, the system worked perfectly. If an Immortal's family became disloyal or involved in politics, he was removed and replaced without anyone noticing. There is no scandal or drama. The line moved forward as if nothing had changed. This was very different from the Greek ethos of glory-seeking, and perhaps the most important strength of the immortal, not his skills or courage. But they knew for certain that they could never truly disappear. The Persian warriors are famous for being great fighters, but they were also wise diplomats. In the Amun worldview, military force wasn't just about taking over land. It was about being there. The immortals were often sent not just to fight, but to be seen, to enter foreign courts as living examples of Persian elegance and power. Their soft robes, shiny weapons, and perfect discipline made them scary in battle, but fascinating in peace. When ambassadors arrived in foreign lands, the immortals often went with them, not to protect them, but to amaze people. Picture a small group of elite soldiers entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men moved together perfectly, wearing fine tunics laced with gold instead of rough leather or blood-stained bronze. They also wore soft felt headdresses and were silent and unreadable. They didn't shout or threaten me. They didn't need to. Their very existence was a negotiation. In satrapies' provinces, immortals were regularly sent to remind local governors where true power came from. They rarely got involved in the running of the country, but they were always watching. If they heard about a group of rebels, they could go to the governor's house. The immortals were so powerful that any kind of rebellion in the provinces was always stopped before it started. Even the royal court, they had many different roles. They were in charge of ceremonies during Norse festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they watched the courtiers, looked for treason, and made sure the king's will was followed without making a noise. Some historians say that they were almost like an internal intelligence agency. They were a constant reminder that loyalty was not optional. This combination of qualities, including being a warrior and a diplomat, an enforcer and a decoration, was part of their talent. Most elite units in ancient times were focused on battle, but the immortals had a much broader role in the empire. War was just one of many tools available to them. Their empire was kept together not just by force, but also by symbols. The immortals understood that fear and awe are closely related. In foreign courts and faraway palaces, their arrival made it very clear what they wanted. The king is watching. The empire will last forever, and it is not worth trying to resist. This way, they fought wars without ever using their swords. All empires become old, and their legends are forgotten. By the later years of the Amanid Empire, the immortals were still feared and respected, but no longer invincible. The machines that had made them immortal started to rust. They did not suddenly break down. They got slowly and gradually less efficient. As Persian kings grew more interested in luxury and intrigue at court, the immortals also began to change. The elite guard was still there, still dressed smartly, and still marching in perfect formation. But there were cracks. The recruitment standards got worse. People with political connections started to get involved. In the past, only the most disciplined and loyal men were chosen for this role. But now nobles use their influence to get their unworthy sons into the 10,000. The result was small but deadly. It's all the same, but it's not lively. It's all rules, but it's not full of passion. This decay became tragically obvious when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BC. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the immortals were sent to help the Persian army to defend Darius III. They fought bravely, but ultimately they were no match for the clever tactics and relentless drive of Alexander's Macedonian army. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. Unfortunately, the myth didn't survive the battle. For hundreds of years, the name Immortals had made people feel amazed and full of respect. But Galgamela showed that they were not as good as they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes I. The system for replacing them quickly stopped working. The backup system that once made their losses invisible was no longer in place. The unit never recovered. When Alexander marched into Peplois and took the royal palace, he found that the empire was already in decline. The immortals weren't there to defend it. The line, which had not been broken, was now broken. But their story didn't end with defeat. Some of the immortals survived. Alexander used Persian traditions in his army. Later in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force rose to power, and historians sometimes called them immortals again. They were not direct descendants, but they told the same story as the original myth. 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, eternal. Even when they fell, the immortals left a plan. They had shown the world how to build not just an army, but a legend. The Persian immortals may have left the battlefield, but their influence never went away. Even after the Achaemenid Empire had fallen, the idea of an unbreakable elite fighting force remained in the minds of generals, kings, and storytellers. They were remembered not because they won every battle, but because they stood for something bigger. The perfect way for the government to control power. A group of soldiers who never got older, never stopped, and never gave up. When the Greeks described them, they were amazed but also a bit suspicious. Herodotus called them immortals because they could not be seen to die, not because they could not be killed. They were replaced straight away, but they will always be remembered. The Greeks thought this was strange and not natural. They were used to war as a chaotic, personal affair. The immortals were different. They were precise, faceless, and disciplined to the point of being almost human. In Roman times, scholars still referred to the ancient gods when talking about power. Even historians from Byzantium, modern-day Turkey, wrote about how impressive they thought the elite guard of the Persian army was. In the early Islamic period, Arab historians told stories about a group of 10,000 people who used to protect old kings. They said that their spears looked like a forest of silver in the desert sun. The idea was brought back in the Sasanian Empire, where a group of elite soldiers on horseback, sometimes called the New Immortals by historians, were like the empire's armored army. They may not have been directly related to the Achaemenid unit, but they had the same mission, to show that the empire was invincible. Even Napoleon Bonaparte studied the Persian military organization hundreds of years later and said it was well organized. The immortals became a part of the myths. Modern media often shows them in a bad light, like monsters or demons. But the truth was far more interesting. They were just like us, really scary. Ordinary men were turned into instruments of empire through relentless training, psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't need magic to become legendary, just consistency and silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword. It was the idea that they were always coming, like an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so the immortals live on in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who know that power, when well organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to immortality. Before there were legends of Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians. They were nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe. They were feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Alai Mountains. Scythian women were different from women in most ancient societies. They did not stay at home weaving cloth or looking after children. They rode horses, used bows and arrows, and went to war. They didn't just go with men into battle. They were excellent leaders and fighters. These were not exceptions. This was the culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were amazed when they met these women. He described tribes where women refused to marry unless they had killed an enemy in a fight. The things he said were originally just interesting, but now we have proof that they are true. Burial mounds called kurgans can be found across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia. They have yielded some amazing discoveries. The skeletons of young women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and even injuries caused by battle. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, and her grave richly furnished. These weren't just for show. They had been used, and so had she. Science society was very different from other societies at that time. Life on the steppe required you to be able to move around easily and be strong. Everyone, man or woman, had to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. Girls as young as boys learned to use bows and arrows. They wore the same leather trousers and the same armor. They even wore their hair and tattoos in a similar way, which made them look the same when they were on horseback and being shot at. This led to a warrior culture where gender roles were more flexible during battles, but strict outside of them. A Saiyan woman could be deadly at full gallop and then go home to do her ritual and maternal duties. The two roles did not clash. They were free. The stories about the Amazons in Greek myths may have come from stories about women in Cyprus that were told to be very exaggerated. But while the mythical Amazon disappeared into fantasy, the Saiyans were real. They fought against the Persians, the Greeks, and the Macedonians. For centuries, they walked the earth with anger and violence, both men and women. In a small West African kingdom called Dahomey, which is modern-day Benin, a group of women were so strong and brave that they frightened the European colonizers and other kingdoms. They were known as the Aogi, but the French gave them a nickname. They called them the Dahomey Amazon because they looked like the Amazon warriors in Greek myths. But these warriors were very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agagogi had become the standing royal guard of the king of Domi. But they weren't just guards. They were a highly trained group of soldiers who were ready to fight and never give up. At first, they might have been elephant hunters or palace servants, but over time, they became a powerful military force. They were recruited as young girls, often chosen for their strength or spirit. The Agagogi were separated from their families and put through very tough training. Everyone was very well behaved. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparred with real blades, and promised to be loyal and not to have sex. They wore braided sashes and carried weapons like muskets, machetes, and clubs. But their most dangerous weapon was the way they thought. People from Europe who saw them in the 19th century were shocked by how brave they were and how cruel they could be. One French officer was shocked to see a Dahomey Amazon run up, cut a man's throat, and then calmly clean her blade. These were not symbolic warriors. They were the first line of defense in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Agogi fought against the French colonial troops. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they still launched night raids, carried out ambushes, and fought in the streets to defend their kingdom. Their determination made the French commanders think again about how they were fighting and what they thought about men and women in combat. But it wasn't just how well they did on the battlefield that mattered. The Dahomey Amazon lived in a world where men had all the power, but they still managed to become completely independent and powerful. They gave advice to kings. They did ceremonial duties and shaped the kingdom's foreign policy not from behind the scenes, but with blades in hand. Although the French won the battle against Domi, the story of the Agogi continued to be told. In fact, their legacy helped inspire fictional warriors like the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But the truth is always more impressive than a story. In the dark pages of Japan's medieval history, there is a story of a woman who rode through blood and legend. Tomo Guzan was a samurai warrior from the late 12th century. She fought during the Jimp War, a brutal civil war between the Minamoto and Taira clans that led to the first shogunate. Tomoe wasn't just a symbolic figure or a passive partner. She was a commander, a swordswoman, and an archer. She had been trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and was feared for her precision in combat. Her story is best known from the Hike Monogatari, a war epic that mixes history with poetic writing. In the story, Tomoe is said to be very beautiful with white skin, long hair, and a charming face. But the next sentence is even better. She was also a very strong archer, and, as a swordswoman, she was a warrior who was worth 1,000 of her male counterparts. The two qualities of beauty and lethality were not opposites. They were combined. Tomoe worked for Minamoto no Yashinaka, a warlord and possibly her lover, during his campaign to take control of Kyoto. She wasn't a camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was right in the middle of the action, reportedly leading troops and even killing several enemies at once. In 1184, at the Battle of Awazu, Yashinaka's forces were surrounded by the rival Minamoto army. Facing defeat, Yashinaka made a final stand. Instead of running away, Tomoe decided to stand his ground and fight. One of her most famous battles was when she jumped off a charging enemy soldier on horseback, fought him on the ground, and cut off his head right there. She then got back on and carried on. That moment, perhaps made more dramatic in the retelling, has been a symbol of her calm and skill for centuries. But no one knows what happened to Tomo after the war. Some people say she was captured and forced to marry. Others say she became a nun and lived a quiet life. Some people think she just disappeared, like a ghost, into the world of legends. No matter what really happened, Tomo Goen's memory lived on in theater, folklore, and the country's collective memory. In a society where gender roles and male domination are the norm, Tomo Goen stood out. She was confident, unafraid, and ready to take on any challenge. She wasn't just fighting for her lord. She was fighting for her right to exist in a world that told her she shouldn't exist. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its strongest. It was well organized and well disciplined, and it looked like nothing could stop it. But then came Boudica, a queen from Britannia with fiery red hair, who almost brought the Roman machine down. Her name would be remembered in history as a symbol of raw vengeance, national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Aini tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Rome, a puppet ruler allowed to maintain power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome ignored his will and took his lands. During this time, Roman officials publicly beat and raped Boudica. It was a brutal way of punishing people for trying to rebel. Instead, it caused a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica brought together several British tribes and led one of the most violent rebellions in Roman history. She wasn't just a figurehead. Roman stories tell of her leading her army from a chariot with a spear in her hand. She was wearing a loose tunic and a big gold necklace. Her fiery hair flowed behind her as she rode, calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her forces attacked Camelum, modern Colchester, burning it to the ground. Next came Londinium, the original London, where she killed Roman colonists and built the city. Historians think that more than 70,000 Romans and people who supported them were killed in just a few months. Her army left a trail of ash and destroyed the enemy's pride. But the Romans, led by Governor Gas Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped. Even though they were much weaker in numbers, they tricked Boudica into a fight where their military skills and clever tactics won the day. The rebellion was put down. Boudica, who was going to lose, is said to have taken poison instead of being caught. Although her uprising failed, Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians said she was a barbarian, but they also said she was very brave and a good leader. For the British people, especially in later centuries, she became a symbol of resistance against unfair rulers, both in their own country and from other countries. In the devastated landscapes of Central Asia, during the Mongol Empire's golden age of expansion, a woman emerged who frightened warriors and embarrassed princes. She did not use a sword, but her sheer physical strength and dominance. Her name was Kudalun, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan. But she didn't just follow him. She built her own legend, one fight at a time. Kudalun was born around 1260 CE. Her father was Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan. Kaidu Khan wanted to be the leader of the Mongol Empire, just like Kublai Khan. Kudalun was raised to be a warrior, and he was trained in archery, horse riding, and how to fight on a battlefield. But she was most famous for her wrestling talent, a sport that is very important and competitive among the Mongols. The Persian historian Rashid Allen says that Kudalun promised she would only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Many people have tried, but none of them worked. Many suitors lost and were embarrassed. Some even bet on the outcome, wagering horses, gold, or herds. People say she collected 10,000 horses from her wins, which made her not just a champion, but also one of the richest women around. But Kudalun wasn't just throwing men onto the dirt for fun. She fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking through enemy lines. During campaigns against both rival Mongol groups and Chinese forces, Kudalun was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even thought about naming her his successor. This was a very unusual move in a culture ruled by male warlords. This did not go down well. Some Mongol nobles said that her influence was wrong and her power was too dangerous. In the end, Kaidu didn't make her his heir, choosing a male relative instead. But people still remembered her. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, wrote about a Mongol princess. She fought like a tiger and was as good at riding and shooting as any man. Later, histories try to make her look good or less important. They made her out to be a woman in love or just a story. But don't be fooled. Kudalun was a real person, and she was extremely strong. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on Earth, a woman could still rise. Not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. At a time when women couldn't vote, own land freely, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only wore armor, she led armies. Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in a small village called Domi. She was a peasant girl and could not read or write. But by the time she was 17, she was in charge of troops, facing kings, and changing the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. She didn't come from a military background or a noble family. Joan said that she was inspired by God. She said she heard voices. They were the voices of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. They told her that she had been chosen to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a crazy claim, and people should have thought she was crazy. Instead, it got her an audience with the future king, Charles III. The court tested her. The clergy questioned her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They saw something special in her. He was sure of himself, had a certain charm, and there was something else about him that you couldn't put your finger on. Joan was ready for battle. She wore white armor and carried a large flag. She was sent to Orleans, a city that was being attacked. This battle would decide the outcome of the war. The French commanders weren't convinced, but Joan's presence made them feel better. She didn't just stand and watch. She led charges, was shot at, and encouraged her soldiers to keep fighting. Against all odds, the French managed to break the siege. The win made the whole country feel excited. Joan became known as the Maid of Orleans, a symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a series of wins, she took Charles to Rams, where he was crowned king, just as the voices had predicted. But being powerful, famous, and doing miracles also means having enemies. In 1430, she was captured by allies of the English who were from Burgundy. An ecclesiastical court, a court of the church, tried Joan. They accused her of heresy, believing in something that goes against the church's teachings, witchcraft, casting spells, and wearing men's clothing, which was a crime that could be punished by death. She was just 19 when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace. But her death made her even more famous. Years later, the church changed its mind. Centuries later, she was made a saint. By the time Nakano Tiko picked up her naginata, a bladed pole arm favored by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. It was the late 1860s, and the samurai class was being dismantled as the country modernized. But in one final stand for the old ways, this young woman would become the last true onagata, a female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nano was born in 1847 into a well-respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she studied important Chinese books, calligraphy, and most importantly, martial arts. Her favorite weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was a symbol of this. Women from the samurai class traditionally used this. This meant that they could reach further and move more easily. Her adoptive father, who was a martial arts expert, taught her until she was as skilled as the best men in her field. By the time she was in her 20s, Nano had become both a teacher and a warrior, teaching other women how to use a sword. But in 1868, when the Boshin War broke out, Nano didn't stay behind. The Boshin War was a civil conflict between the imperial forces and the old Tokugawa shogunate. She fought for Aizu, one of the last strongholds of traditional samurai resistance. Women weren't allowed to officially serve, but Nano formed an unofficial group of female fighters called the Josh Tai, the Women's Army. Dressed in traditional Japanese clothing, these women fought bravely alongside the men. They did this to protect their families, their city, and their way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Nano led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against Imperial troops armed with rifles. Witnesses say she killed several enemies before being shot in the chest. Knowing she was very badly hurt and unwilling to be caught or touched, she asked her sister to cut her head off. Her body was buried at a temple in Fukushima, with her sword beside her. Nano was very brave, even when things didn't go well. Today, statues of her can be found in Japan, particularly in Aizu. There, she is remembered not only as a warrior, but also as a woman who refused to bow to modernity, to the patriarchy, or to death itself. In the ruins of World War II, one name made German soldiers on the Eastern Front feel afraid. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was known as Lady Death by her enemies. She wasn't a made-up person, a way to boost morale, or a figure created for propaganda. She was a real person. A Soviet sniper who killed 309 enemy soldiers, including 36 other snipers. She was the most deadly female sniper in recorded history. Pavlichenko was born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine. She was competitive from a young age. She loved her country and was a very good shot. When Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and studying history at university. But instead of reading, she picked up a rifle and joined the Red Army. At first, officials suggested she become a nurse. She refused. She wanted a combat role, as she got one. She fought at the front during the sieges of Odessa and Sevastopol. Pavlichenko earned her reputation the hard way. She spent long hours lying still in the freezing ground, waiting for the perfect moment to shoot. Her targets weren't just ordinary soldiers. She hunted officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She was very calm, very patient, and hated the invaders. She killed so many people that she was moved from the front line and sent on a tour of the United States, Canada, and the UK to improve international relations. There, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and became friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her calmness and intelligence. Pavlichenko gave speeches telling the Allies to launch a second attack in Europe and laughing at reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she didn't disappear into obscurity. She earned her degree, became a historian, and trained future generations of Soviet snipers. She was hurt in the war, but her memory lives on. She was given the Hero of the Soviet Union medal and is still considered a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world where some people often question the role of women in war, Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not argue. She didn't say no. She was simply better at her job than almost anyone who ever lived. There are lots of famous people like Budaka, Tom Moy-Guzin, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, but there are also lots of others whose stories have been forgotten. History was mostly written by men, and when women picked up swords, rifles, or spears, they were often left out of history, made less important than they were, or turned into stories. But don't be fooled. Brave women have always been around, all over the world. They haven't always spoken up, but that was not their choice. Think about the Trung sisters of Vietnam. They were called Trung Trac and Trungi. They led a fight against the Chinese occupation in the 1st century. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of followers, and ruled an independent state for 3 years before being defeated by superior Chinese forces. Today, there are temples and festivals that remember their resistance, but you don't often hear about them in history books. Another example is the Asantewar of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who led a rebellion against British colonial forces in 1900. As Queen Mother, she led her people when the British demanded the Golden Stool, a symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She gave passionate speeches and led her troops into battle, showing that leadership and defiance were not just for men. There were Viking shield maidens, but they were probably not as common as legend suggests. Archaeological finds show that women were buried with weapons, armor, and even war horses. They were not buried as ceremonial tokens, but as warriors. There were Apache women fighters in the American Southwest, like Lozin. She was a spiritual warrior who rode and fought beside her brother, the famous leader Victoria. In every era and region, warrior women fought for different reasons. They might have wanted to conquer, but more often they wanted to protect. They fought to defend their families, their cultures, and their homes. Some led armies. Others fought on their own in resistance movements. Some of them were queens, and some of them were ordinary people. But they showed that war was not just for men. Now, their legacy is being taken back. Scholarly research and pop culture are both showing us the stories of these women again. And every time I find out a name that I thought I forgot, it reminds me. History is not just what was written down. It's also what was erased. These women didn't ask to be remembered. They asked to be respected. And slowly, the world is beginning to listen. In ancient Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, music was more than just a form of entertainment. It was about ritual, power, and language. And no instrument embodied this more than the lyre. The Mesopotamian lyre is one of the world's oldest stringed instruments. It was invented over 4,500 years ago in the Sumerian city of. Music was an important part of temple ceremonies and royal court life there. The lyres weren't just simple harps made from wood. They were intricate and beautifully crafted objects, often decorated with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and detailed animal motifs. One of the best-known examples is the bull-headed lyre, which was found in a royal tomb in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley. The sound box was shaped like a bull's body, and the instrument's head was covered in gold leaf, with lapis lazuli for its beard. But this wasn't just for show. The bull was a symbol of strength, and its presence on a lyre may have been a spiritual message, not just for decoration. If you played the lyre with your fingers or a small plectrum, it would make a haunting, resonant sound. We can't hear ancient melodies exactly as they were, but scholars believe the Sumerians used a heptonic scale, which is 7 notes, much like modern Western music. Old clay tablets with musical notes on them give us a few clues about how people thought about music and scales a long time ago. These lyres weren't just confined to the palace. In temples, music was played while people made offerings and prayed to the gods. People sang hymns with instruments like harps and flutes to honor deities like Inanna and Enlil. This made music a special connection between humans and the divine. The dead were mourned by itinerant writers who helped guide souls into the afterlife. They weren't just instruments. They were the voices of change. In Mesopotamia, musicians were highly respected members of society. Some of them were female priestesses, while others were performers in the royal court. They would learn complex songs by heart, often in schools for scribes and musicians, where they would learn from a young age. Today, copies of these ancient instruments are played in museums and during reconstructions. Their soft, twanging sounds remind us that long before Mozart, medieval minstrels, or even Homer's sung epics, humans were playing music in the desert, chasing beauty and sound. While the lyres sang gently to the gods, the owls screamed, wept, and danced through the hearts of the ancient Greeks. This reedless, double-piped wind instrument was not a gentle flute. It was wild, emotional, and never-ending. To the ancient Greeks, music was more than just a form of entertainment. It was ethos, a force that shaped the soul. The aloes showed its most basic characteristics. The aloes was associated with Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. This was in contrast to the lyre, which was associated with Apollo, the god of harmony and order. It was often played during important ceremonies, in the theater, and by the army. This meant that it could be used to express different emotions and for different purposes. It was made up of 2 pipes, usually made of wood, bone, or ivory, each with its own reed and fingering holes. The musician played both pipes at the same time, which made a loud, deep sound like a bagpipe, not a modern flute. This needed great breath control. Musicians often used a technique called circular breathing. This is where they inhaled through the nose while pushing air out through the cheeks. This allowed them to play continuously. The effort made their faces look strange and made their cheeks bulge. Sometimes, athletes would make fun of all-rounders because of how they looked. Even though people made jokes about it, all the players were respected and even admired by some people. The olas was not for playing in the background. It made people feel excited in ancient Greek theater. It was used in both tragedies and comedies, adding feeling and energy to performances by Sophocles and Euripides. In battle, it kept the soldiers marching in step, its loud voice cutting through the chaos. During the ancient Bacchic rituals, it made the dancers go into a trance, which made it seem like there was no difference between the dancers and the spirits. Plato had a complicated relationship with the Oos in his Republic. He was well known for saying that it was too emotionally overwhelming, and he preferred instruments like the lyre and cathara because they were clear in their thinking. But even he had to admit that it was powerful. The owls could make us feel sad, angry, or happy, sometimes all at the same time. Today, we can still see fragments of ancient alloy in museums, and modern copies show how powerful it was. The aloes wasn't about perfection, unlike the mathematically balanced lyre. It was about being free. It was full of sound, like frenzy, sadness, seduction, and war. In old China, Music was more than just art. It was like philosophy in action. The guin and the guzheng are two-stringed zither that are very important in Chinese music. They were used to make music during important periods in Chinese history, as well as for meditation and for writing poetry. They may look similar at first, but each one played a different part in shaping China's musical identity. The jin is the elder of the two, with a history of over 3,000 years. It has 7 strings and a long wooden body with no frets, and it makes quiet, subtle sounds. To the untrained ear, the guzheng sounds almost like a whisper. The music is like a gentle slide, a nice harmony, and a plucked note that makes you think of raindrops on old tiles. But to Chinese scholars and wise people, these sounds showed the balance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself played the guin because he believed that it helped people to be more moral and feel happier. In ancient China, learning to play the guzheng wasn't about becoming a performer. It was about becoming civilized. Compare this with the guzheng, a younger, louder version with a brighter sound and a more public life. Modern versions of the guzheng have 16 to 21 strings or more, and were built for performance. Its curved wooden frame and movable bridges make it easy to play rich melodies and dramatic glissandos. Musicians pluck the strings with their fingers, creating sounds that shimmer like flowing water. It was popular in palaces, folk music, and even military camps. When the guin spoke quietly to the soul, the guzheng sang to the crowd. Both instruments were used in rituals and storytelling. The guin was often used at events like poetry readings, philosophical lectures, and meditation. The guzheng was used in banquets, operas, and to recount historical epics. The music could be like the sound of galloping horses, flowing rivers, or sad lovers, all played on silk strings with expert fingers. These instruments also represented gendered spaces in ancient China. The guin was traditionally played by male scholars, while the guzheng became more associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Both were respected, taught in schools, and written into the Confucian beliefs about education. Today, both guin and guzheng are still played. People play them in classical and contemporary settings. They're a living reminder of China's ancient soul, where music was not just something you heard, but something you felt, and it could guide you towards being a better person and experiencing strong emotions. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just background noise. It was a special tool that was used to talk to God. You could hear it in temples, tombs, and people's daily lives. From pharaohs to ordinary people, music was everywhere. It was used to help people in pain, to honor the dead, to guide religious rituals, and to entertain people. The instruments that created this sound were as different as the Nile itself. One of the oldest and most well-known Egyptian instruments was the harp. Early harps, curved like bows, evolved into larger angular harps that stood as tall as a man. These instruments were often plucked with the fingers by musicians or entertainers. Harps were used for more than just art. They were connected to the afterlife. Tomb paintings often show harpists playing for the souls of the dead, to make their journey into the afterlife easier. Then came the siren, a special rattle that was connected to the goddess Hathor, who was associated with music, motherhood, and joy. The cymbal was made of metal with loose crossbars. When you shook it, it made a jangling sound. It wasn't subtle, but it was powerful. People used it in temples to call on gods, clean the buildings, and get rid of bad spirits. People used to think that shaking a siren would make the gods happy and keep the world in order. Flutes, often made from reeds or bones, added soft melodies to religious processions and rituals. The double clarinet, with 2 pipes played at the same time, created a rich, buzzing harmony, similar to the oboes of Greece. Percussion instruments included frame drums, hand clappers, and castanets, especially during dances and festivals. Professional musicians in Egypt had good jobs. Many were women who were often shown in art playing the harp or singing and working in temples. These women were more than just entertainers. They were leaders of Ammon, musicians of Isis, and symbols of spiritual power. Music was used to honor gods, accompany offerings, and mark the transition between life and death. The Egyptian way of writing music is still a mystery. Unlike in Mesopotamia or Greece, there are not many musical records left. But their instruments, which are shown in tombs and temples, tell us a lot. The ancient Egyptians saw music as having a structure, emotion, and magic. Even after his death, music was very important to him. Instruments were buried with the elite, as their owners believed that they would play again in the Egyptian paradise. To them, music wasn't just something they did in their spare time. It was the language of eternity. Long before writing was invented, ancient African cultures used a much more basic way of recording history: rhythm. Across the continent, drums were more than just instruments. They were voices. They spoke, commanded, remembered, and summoned. In Africa's ancient societies, music, especially the drumming, was a way of life. It was a living, breathing language that carried stories, laws, identities, and the pulse of the divine. The drums were different depending on the region and the reason for using them. But one of the most well-known was the talking drum found in West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass and strung with leather cords, this drum could imitate the musical language of the people. Skilled drummers could speak entire phrases by adjusting the tension in the drum skin while hitting it with a curved stick. Messages were sent across villages to announce births, deaths, warnings, or royal summons. Long before paper or the postal system existed, the drum was used as a way to send messages without wires. But drums weren't just practical, they were also spiritual. In ancient kingdoms like Kush and No, people used drums to call on their ancestors and gods. In Ephra and Benin, they honored kings and gods in elaborate court rituals. Drumming was a key part of initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, and funerals. People say that beating a sacred drum can awaken powers beyond the veil. African drums come in many different types: Jem, Dundun, Bugarabu, and Kadi. Each musician has a specific role in a musical group. They were made from a single log, carefully hollowed out and covered with animal hide. Each one was tuned to a specific pitch or tone. The craftsmanship was very important and was passed down from father to son with rituals. These rituals were even part of the process of making the instruments. And percussion wasn't just limited to drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and thumb pianos added layers of rhythm and melody, creating a complex, multi-rhythmic sound. Western music wouldn't fully understand this sound until centuries later. In African tradition, music and movement go together. You were just listening, you were dancing, breathing, sweating to it. The drummer wasn't a performer. He was a way for energy, spirit, and memory to flow between people. These rhythms spread through the trans-Saharan trade, the Nile, and later the Atlantic slave trade, influencing music in places like Brazil and the Caribbean. But they always loved Africa, where being black was not just a performance. It was about who they were, where they came from, and how to stay alive. High in the Andean Mountains, where the air is thin and the clouds touch the ground, the sound of music filled the stone cities and terrace fields. It wasn't coming from stringed instruments or drums, but from the wind. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Machuca, and Inca developed a rich musical tradition. This tradition was centered around aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most famously panpipes, or SECU. The secu looks simple, but it's actually quite complicated. It can be made up of multiple bamboo tubes, of different lengths. These can be lashed together in a row or stacked in double rows. Each tube plays one note, and players quickly switch between rows to make melodies. The result is a haunting, breathy harmony that echoes across mountains like a conversation with the wind itself. The pieces were often played together as a pair. Two players play notes at the same time in patterns that fit together. This is called hocketing. It shows the Andean idea of duality and balance in nature and society. Flutes made of bone, clay, or reeds were also common. Some are so small that they can be worn as necklaces, while others are large enough to make deep, resonant sounds. Many were carved into the shapes of birds, snakes, or spirits, showing the spiritual connection between sound and the natural world. These weren't just musical instruments, they were sacred tools. Music was used to call rain, bless harvests, honor the sun, or communicate with ancestors. One of the most interesting things we found was the ceramic whistling vessels of the Mka civilization. When water was poured into them, air was forced through a whistle in the inner chambers, making strange musical sounds. These were probably used in rituals that combined water, air, and sound. In Inca society, music was a big part of every part of life. There was music for every occasion: birthdays, funerals, military parades, and agricultural festivals. Inca musicians played for gods like the sun and the earth, offering their breath as a form of spiritual devotion. Even soldiers marched to the sound of flute music, turning warfare into a kind of dance. The Spanish came and went, taking with them many of the traditions of the people who already lived there. But the sound of the Andean flute was never completely lost. Today, you can still hear the effects of this in the Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages. A voice that has been around for thousands of years, made of stone, wind, and sky, can still be heard in the air. In ancient India, music was more than just a performance. It was like something from a sci-fi film. According to Hindu beliefs, the universe came into existence from a sound called Om. This belief led to one of the world's most complex and long-lasting musical traditions, which is based on ritual, mathematics, and spiritual change. Even the oldest texts, like the Vedas, which are from at least 1500 BCE, already have hymns known as Saman chants. These are meant to be sung, not just recited. These hymns were sung during religious rituals. They were sung in a special way to make the people feel connected to God. The Brahmins were trained in philosophy, fire offerings, voice modulation, and musical rhythm. It was very important to be precise. If you pronounce a note incorrectly, it could disrupt the ritual. The earliest instruments used in Vedic and post-Vedic India served both sonic, musical, and symbolic representational roles. The Vienna, a plucked string instrument with a resonating gourd, became a symbol of learning and divine expression. It was and still is connected to the goddess Saraswati, who is associated with wisdom and the arts. Its strings were said to create vibrations that mirrored the universe, allowing the player to connect with universal truths through melody. Wind instruments like the bansuri bamboo flute were not only tools of melody, but vehicles of myth. Lord Krishna, the god of love and fun, was often shown playing the flute, which made humans and animals happy. The sound of the bansuri was thought to break through the illusions of reality and take listeners to a higher state of consciousness. Percussion instruments were also very powerful. The midangam and tabo weren't just there to keep the rhythm. They were like the heartbeat, breathing, and natural world. Rhythms, or talis, were complex mathematical patterns, some of which were cyclical and some of which were asymmetrical. Each one was linked to how people were feeling in the time of day. Indian music was closely connected to Rasa theory, the idea that music should create certain feelings like love, heroism, calm, or sadness. Even in ancient times, ragas, or melodic frameworks were designed to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient traditions that have been lost over time, India's musical roots have not only survived, they've evolved. But they still believe that making music is a divine connection. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, from the huge pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Aztecs, music was closely connected to religion. It wasn't just art. It was used to speak to gods, make blood offerings holy, bring rain, and scare enemies. For the people of Mesoamerica, music was a kind of ritual technology. It was a hidden connection between humans and the gods and those who had died. The drums were the most prominent sound. The most famous of these was the huedel, a tall drum with a single head that was made from a hollowed-out tree trunk and was played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and decorated with symbols or images, the huedel was used during festivals, wars, and sacrifices. Its deep, loud sound echoed through stone courtyards like the heartbeat of the gods. Then came the tianasti, a slit drum made of hollowed wood that is played with rubber-tipped mallets. The surface of the stone was carved into two tongues. When the tongues were struck, they produced different pitches. The tianasti wasn't just a rhythm instrument. It could speak. In the Aztec language, Nahuatl, it was said that tianasti could sing the names of gods or the rhythms of fate itself. Wind instruments were also very important. Flutes made of bone, clay, and reeds were common. They were often shaped like animals or gods. Some were so detailed that they could copy the sounds made by birds, jaguars, or people screaming. The Aztec death whistle is shaped like a skull and is blown like a flute. It makes a blood-chilling shriek. It was possibly used during war or sacrificial ceremonies to make enemies afraid or to open doors to the spirit world. Music was a big part of life. It was played at every major event, including births, coming-of-age rites, warfare, and death. Musicians and dancers were trained in special schools. They performed not just for crowds, but for the gods. Some instruments were only used by nobles or priests. Playing them incorrectly could be seen as a spiritual insult. Even sacrifice, an important part of Aztec religion, was done to the sound of a musical score. Drums banged, flutes played, and conch shells sounded as gifts were offered to the sun. The music didn't help. It activated. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the cosmic engine running. In Mesoamerica, music was more than just a backdrop. It was the ceremony. It wasn't meant to entertain. It was supposed to change. The music of ancient civilizations may have disappeared, but it has never been completely forgotten. It remains not just in sound, but also in rituals, designs, and our cultural identity. In the past, people didn't think sheet music or recordings would be useful for keeping ancient music alive. People shared it with their hands, mouths, and hearts. It is a living tradition that is remembered and performed. Take the Chinese guinea pig or the Indian civet. These aren't museum pieces. People still play them today, often using techniques that have been passed down for thousands of years. Performers don't just copy old sounds. They're the perfect example of this. Every note has hundreds of years of philosophy, culture, and meditation in it. One pluck can make you feel the same way about something that an emperor or wise person once felt. In Africa, the drums still speak. The movements of the gamber, the interaction of go, and the combination of dance all reflect practices that are very old, even predating colonial maps and written history. Even in the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous tribes reflects echoes of ancestral voices. Some of these instruments are direct descendants of ancient instruments, while others are inspired reinventions of these same instruments. Even today, we can still find traces of ancient concepts in modern Western music. The seven-note heptonic scale used in Mesopotamia was the first step in the development of modern harmony. Theory about music from Greece, including modes and intervals, and the way of thinking about music influenced early Christian chant. This eventually led to the development of classical music and the creation of new instruments. The lyre became the guitar. The oboe and bassoon were inspired by the old-style flute. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the purpose of ancient music. It wasn't meant to sell tickets or top charts. It was a ritual. It was healing. It marked birth and death, sowing and harvest, love and war. It meant something. Even today, music is still our universal language. It can make us feel emotions without using words and bring people together. In a digital world full of noise, ancient music reminds us that sound can be sacred, that rhythm can be memory, and melody a connection between worlds. No matter how our ancestors' songs were sung, quietly, loudly, or with a drum, they still echo. We just have to listen.